now we can continue, I think, with Akshay Rangesh. Hi. So he's from Laboratory for Intelligent and Safe Automobiles from UC San Diego, and stage is yours. I think it's night there.
Yeah, it is late at night. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Great. I'm sorry about the weird resolution. I just have this home setup, so I might not look directly at the camera. But thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. And good morning. My name is Akshay Rangesh, and I'm a PhD candidate at the LISA lab at UC San Diego, where I'm advised by Professor Mohan Trivedi. I'm here today to talk about our work on semi-automatic labeling approaches for driver behavior models. So before I start, I would like to give some definitions and motivations for our work. So consider this figure shown where the vehicle is initially operating autonomously as seen on the left, and then the vehicle encounters a confounding situation and issues a takeover request, which could be either auditory or visual in nature, after which the human driver is expected to take control of the vehicle and transition into manual operation. So these transitions are just an unavoidable reality until complete level 5 autonomy is attained. So it is essential that we ensure it is done safely and smoothly. And to do that, it is necessary to monitor the driver and the driver behavior. So the two important entities we focus on estimating to do this is the driver's readiness and the takeover time. And for those of you who don't know this, the takeover time is basically the time between when the takeover request is issued and when the driver and the moment the driver assumes complete control of the vehicle. It is also important to for us at least to use as much real world data as we can. And this is primarily because there are many real world variables that can't be accounted for in simulators, and the domain shift between simulators and the real world is not well understood. In this talk, I would also like to take an ML ops perspective. And by doing so, I hope to bring out some of the issues that arise when one tries to go beyond just a working prototype and aims to deploy at scale and across different conditions. For example, a robust driver behavior model should work well across different vehicle types and cabin types, and should work irrespective of the sensor mount positions. It should also work irrespective of the type of sensor used. So as we know, this is a very challenging job, and designing such a model may be unfeasible, unfortunately, because if you look at the no free lunch theorem and other such experiences, usually training such models is usually not possible. So the route we instead take in this research is to make the data collection and labeling as efficient and automatic as we can. So by doing this, we actually make deploying of models into new conditions much easier than it usually would. So to give you an overview of our approach, consider this illustration of a driver inside a car involved in a secondary activity. In this case, the driver is drinking a beverage. We then use different sensors to capture different parts of the driver and process them independently. So as shown here, we have 3 separate blocks for processing: the hand, gaze, and foot behaviors of the driver. So these individual blocks then produce mid to high level features describing different aspects of driver behavior that are then fed to this downstream sequential takeover time estimation model. So TOT over here stands for takeover time. And in a similar manner, we could assume that you have some outside looking sensors that does perception looking outside and produces some summary statistics such as time to collision or similar metrics. So the governing logic inside the car could then use this estimated takeover time and the time to collision and come up with some sort of necessary condition or rule to initiate the takeover request. So in this case, for example, we say that an example of the rule could be if the takeover time is much, much smaller in comparison to the time to collision, you could issue a takeover request. And if it is not, then the vehicle comes to standstill or does some other safe maneuver and doesn't sort of transfer control to the driver. So let's focus first on the hand behavior analysis block. And so this talk is going to focus primarily looking inside, and I'm going to describe each of the blocks here. So the first one is the hand analysis block. So analyzing hands is extremely important for takeover time estimation. And this is because from the definition of takeover time estimation, we assume that the driver takes complete control of the vehicle. So for that to happen, the driver has to actually move their hands and actually take hold of the wheel. So we need to know the exact location of the hand in 3D. We also need to know the objects that the driver is interacting with, because that could give be an important cue about the activity the driver is involved in. But there's many challenges involved in doing this. For instance, hands are deformable objects, so there's various forces, and there's other things such as illumination. And we also need to do 3D estimation. So detecting hands in just 2D is not enough. And any model that we come up with would potentially require large amounts of diverse label data. So our solution to this is to use two complementary solutions. One is Chroma Keying, and Chroma Keying basically, as you can see in this image, refers to either using green bodysuits or green screens to segment out different parts of the image. And we also use auxiliary sensors. In this particular case, we use a Kinect sensor, which consists of both an RGB camera and a depth camera. And we, combining these two, we are able to automatically label all our data without any with very little human supervision, I should say. So this is our proposed pipeline. So let us assume that we want to train a model that takes in as input the depth image, which you can see on the top left. This depth image, let's say, is fed into a hand segmentation network that produces hand instances that are sort of pixel-wise segmentations for each hand. And then each hand instance is processed separately to produce the object held in the hand. So to get labels to train the hand segmentation network, what we do is we use Chroma Keying on the RGB image that is registered to the depth image, as you can see here. Also, as you can see in the RGB image, the subject is actually wearing green colored gloves. And that is what makes this Chroma Keying possible. So we can use the fact that there is a particular green color that the gloves are, so we can easily segment out those hand regions and get the segmentation masks that are then used to supervise the hand segmentation network. And similarly, we can use a semi-automatic tracking-based approach to get the object labels. So what this involves is we manually label the object held in each hand in the first frame, and then the object is tracked across frames for the rest of the video, and we get object labels for the rest of the video. And both these things combined together can give us the labels that we need for training with very little human intervention. So here's an example of the Chroma Key labels that we obtain from this approach. So as you can see on the left, we have the depth image. On the right, we have the registered RGB image. And you can see the subject is wearing green colored gloves. And in the middle, we have the Chroma Key labels that we obtain. And these labels are used to supervise our hand segmentation model. So just to give you some numbers, even if we just collected this data or did this procedure for a couple of hours, we get hundreds of thousands of images for training. And another key thing to note here is, although we use data that was captured in a stationary vehicle for training, most of our testing time data comes from real world drives, naturalistic drives in the real world under real world conditions. And here are some examples. Video, and once again, these drives are from actual real world drives. So the car is moving and the illumination conditions are quite harsh. So San Diego is pretty sunny. So the depth values are very noisy and we still seem to do pretty well. And you can see that we also classify the objects, and the color of each hand instance is based on the distance to the steering wheel. So that's the actual 3D distance, which is an important feature for us. Okay, so next we move on to the head or gaze behavior analysis. So for this problem, as most people are aware, the driver's face is an extremely important cue for the following reasons. So where the driver is looking, or the driver's gaze behavior, is a very important cue or indicator of the driver's attention or inattention, or even the drowsiness state. It can also be used to predict the driver's intention or activity. And once again, there are many challenges associated with this. The common challenges are, once again, illumination and nighttime conditions. There might also be eyeglasses that the driver is wearing, and there could also be potentially different camera locations, and you have to estimate gaze across all of these locations. So our approach to this was, can we make the problem more tractable? So can we reduce the problem into a smaller sub-problem instead? So what we did is we came up with this gaze processing pipeline. So our pipeline consists of many sequential steps. So the first step is, once we have an input image, we actually detect the facial landmarks using OpenPose, which is a publicly available, very popular model or set of models. Using these facial landmarks, we then crop out the eye region in the image, which you can see here on the right. And then we use the histogram equalized eye region image and feed it into a gaze estimation model, which then produces our output gaze zone probabilities. So by actually cropping out the eye regions, we restrict the problem and reduce the variability in the data by focusing just on the eyes. So, and the second way we actually reduce the problem is by considering it as a classification problem instead of a regression problem. Because in our experience and from other real world studies, very fine-grained gaze directions are not necessary. So you don't need continuous gaze directions as long as you know the approximate region the driver is looking at. So in this case, as you can see, the different colored regions, we have different gaze zones. So it could be looking forward, looking at the rear view mirror, looking at the left mirror, right mirror, and so on. And instead of labeling each image, so the usual approach is you collect a bunch of data and then you label each image individually, right? So instead of doing that, we thought of a more automated approach where we actually collected data in a more controlled environment and basically a more controlled procedure that could give us the labels as a byproduct. So for example, we asked each human subject to sit in a stationary car and fix their gaze to a particular gaze zone for a fixed amount of time, let's say about 15 seconds. And we also asked the subject to change their head pose and make a few other body pose movements while focusing their gaze on the same gaze zone. And this gives us variability in our data. So by doing so and creating separate clips, 15-second clips, since we have given the subject specific instructions, we already know the gaze zone of the data, so we don't have to label it later on. And by repeating this process for each of the gaze zone, we get a 15-second clip, let's say, for each gaze zone, which we already have the label for. And once again, we repeat the same process for different subjects. And at the end of the data collection process, we already have the labels. So you could just sample images from different videos, and based on which video it came from, you know the label. So these are examples from our train model. And as you can see, the eye box is the input to the model, and the gaze zone is written at the top, the predicted gaze zone. And as you can see, it's pretty accurate. So like I had mentioned before, there are many additional challenges involved in predicting gaze in the real world. And one of them is eyeglasses. And there are many different types of eyeglasses. There might be clear reflective eyeglasses that introduce artifacts into the images, or there could be thick rimmed glasses that sort of partially occlude the eyes, or there could be sunglasses that are not see-through at all. So we could use the same approach that I described before for data collection to get labeled data with and without glasses. So you know which data comes from subjects with glasses, and you know which data comes from subjects without glasses, and you know the gaze zone for each of those videos. And once you have data collected for with and without eyeglasses, you could train an eyeglass removal network. So we trained a conditional GAN, which we call the gaze preserving cycle GAN, that removes eyeglasses while preserving the gaze of the original image. So the GP cycle GAN and the gaze net, which is the gaze classifier, are trained in 3 steps using unpaired images. So in the first step, as you can see here, we just train the normal gaze classifier, which is a squeeze net model highlighted here in blue, using just images without glasses. Next, we train a cycle GAN with that is used to transfer from images without glasses to images with glasses and vice versa. And we also add a gaze preservation loss, which is a feature loss based on our squeeze net that was trained from step 1. And finally, in the step 3, we actually fine tune both our eyeglass removal network and our gaze classifier network together using images from both images with and without eyeglasses. So this three-step training process gives us both the eyeglass removal network and the gaze classifier network. So I can show you some qualitative results of our eyeglass removal network. So we first tried our approach on the Columbia gaze data set, which is data captured under fairly controlled conditions, like good lighting and a high quality camera. So as you can see, our approach in the bottom row removes the eyeglasses from the original image while retaining the gaze direction. So the gaze does not change. And another interesting thing to note is in some cases, the model actually swaps out the eyes themselves. So the eye colors might change or the eye types might change, but the gaze direction is still the same. And that is the most important thing because our downstream task is gaze classification. So we also have results from real world drives. So this is an example from one of our data sets, which was captured during actual drives. And as you can see, there's a lot of reflections and other sort of artifacts introduced because of the lighting conditions. But in most cases, we are able to remove the eyeglasses and the artifacts while retaining the gaze. And here's a video result. So this blue bar at the bottom is basically the class activation maps that we get from the gaze classifier. And we visualize to see that. So basically what that shows is in most cases, the high activations are localized around the eye, which is what we expect because you're classifying the gaze. Okay. So finally, we move on to foot behavior analysis. So for the foot behavior analysis, we actually skipped the modeling part because we found an easier way to do this. So as you can see in the image here, what we did was we actually drilled holes into both the brake and the gas pedal covers, and we actually mounted small form factor IR sensors on the back. And these IR sensors basically give us range measurements up to 25 centimeters. So if a driver's foot is approaching one of these pedals, we actually get accurate distance measurements. And this is more than enough to give us like very good preparatory features from the driver's foot. And yeah, the key thing is, the key takeaway here is, I guess, if a sensor can reliably give you the data that you need or the features that you need, you can skip the modeling part. You don't have to unnecessarily complicate this. So finally, let's move on to the takeover time estimation block, which is actually the final goal. So the takeover time estimation block, as you can see here, receives features from each of these individual blocks and produces continuous estimates of the takeover time. So our approach to takeover time basically is a hierarchical approach. So at the first stage, we have the individual sort of low-level models, which I just described before. So there's the face analysis models, there's hand analysis models, and we also have foot-related features. And these models can be retrained quite easily for new environments and new conditions using the approaches that I've just described. And these models then feed in mid to high level features to a sequential TOT model, like an LSTM in this case. And these features are sensor agnostic features, like the distance of the hands to the wheel, the driver's gaze direction, the distance of the foot to the pedal, and so on. And what I mean by sensor agnostic is it doesn't matter which sensor these features came from, as long as you can produce these features. The takeover time estimation model is agnostic to this actual sensors used. And finally, we have the sequential LSTM model produces the three different times of interest, which is the time till eyes are on the road, time till hands are on the wheel, and time till the foot is on the pedal. And these three times together define the takeover time, which we consider to be the maximum of these three times. Because if these three things happen, then we assume that the driver is in complete control of the car. One key thing to note here is since the TOD model is essentially agnostic to where the features came from, this TOD model itself only needs to be trained once, and then it can be used across any different settings without retraining, because all that would need to be retrained is the models in block A. And this is very important because takeover time data is very, very expensive and hard to collect. And this is something that I will sort of make clear in the next few slides. So to actually get a real world data set for takeover time data, what we did was we collected a first of its kind large scale real world data set of control transitions and takeovers. So we enlisted 89 subjects to drive a Tesla Model S that had autopilot features enabled. And during the drive, each test subject is asked to undertake a variety of secondary tasks. And these tasks could be something like texting on the phone, or talking on the phone, or reading a book, or drinking a beverage, and so on. And when they're engaged in the secondary task, an auditory alert or a takeover request is issued. And the drivers are instructed that when they hear this request, they have to abandon whatever they were engaged in and actually take control of the car. And we measure this time between the takeover request and when they actually take control, and that gives us our ground truth takeover time. So once we have this data, we actually label the three times that I just talked about in the few previous slides. Those three times are the eyes on road time, and the hands on wheel time, and the foot on pedal time. And our actual desired takeover time is basically the maximum of these three times. So even though we conducted this large scale takeover time study, which hasn't been done before, it is still very limited and expensive to capture. To give you some context, we actually spent more than a year collecting this data, and we still ended up with only 1065 unique takeover events. So those are just 1065 unique samples. So this introduced challenges for training any neural network or for TOD estimation. As you guys may already know, most neural networks require large amounts of data, and this is not up to the mark. We also need to take care of or avoid overfitting, as this is more prevalent in the limited data regime for neural networks. So to address all these problems, we actually proposed a new augmentation scheme that basically increases our available data for training by an order of magnitude. And hopefully this reduces chances of overfitting as well. So to explain our data augmentation scheme, let me first show you a visual illustration of one sample from our takeover time data set. So consider this horizontal timeline that you see here. So the takeover request is issued here, and then this is where the driver has their eyes on the road, foot on the pedal, and hands on the wheel. So the input to the model is a feature, our features aggregated from 2 seconds prior to the takeover request. And the desired outputs are the eyes on road time, the foot on pedal time, and the hands on wheel time. So both these things put together give us one sample of our training data. And now let me show you a proposed data augmentation scheme. So we look at the same timeline again. So instead of using the original takeover request, what we create is an augmented takeover request that happens actually after the original takeover request. You could think of this as a pseudo takeover request. And once again, we do the same process where we aggregate features 2 seconds before this augmented takeover request, and we adjust the 3 target times accordingly, assuming that this was when the augmented takeover request was when the actual takeover request happened. And all of this works on the assumption that the driver's behavior doesn't change drastically if the takeover request was issued at this point rather than this point. And so each such augmented takeover request generates one sample, and we can gain many such samples by moving the augmented takeover request from the original takeover request all the way till the end of the actual takeover. So this is a form of dataset augmentation during training. So to give you some actual quantitative numbers, so if a raw data set consists of about 1,000 samples, after augmentation, we are able to increase the number of training samples to 47,000 approximately. And not just that, we notice that when the model is trained on this augmented data set, we get much better MAEs compared to when it's just trained on the original raw data set, which is excellent. And finally, let me just give you some qualitative examples. So up here, we have some camera views, one looking outside and a few others looking at the drivers. And so this vertical line right here is when the takeover request will be issued. And these 3 colored dots are when the driver would look to the road, put their hands on the wheel, and put their foot on the pedal. So these are the ground truth times, and we'll show what the actual predicted times were from the model. So as you can see, we pretty closely predict each of the 3 times. And by doing that, we can also get a pretty good estimation of the actual takeover time. So this is a second example where the driver is actually texting on the phone. So as you can see here, in this case, the hands-on wheel time is much larger than before. And that's because the driver is actually texting. So they have to put the phone down and actually resume the task of driving. So we can see that in most cases, we are pretty close within half a second to most of the times. So this is the end of this part of the talk. I would like to quickly go to a second part, but let me give you a few key takeaways. And the takeaways, I would like to present them as questions. So whenever you're working on a new project, ask yourself the following. Can I leverage sensors, models, or additional processing at training time to automatically obtain labels? And this is something we did for the hand analysis blocks. Can I collect data in a way that reduces or removes the need for labeling? And this is what we did for the gaze analysis block. Can I deploy sensors that reliably reproduce the functionality of a complex modeling block? And this is what we did for the foot analysis. And finally, can I think of task-specific augmentations that can make the most of the data I have? And this is what we did for the takeover time estimation part. So before I finish my talk, I would like to quickly present an exciting data set that we have been working on with our collaborators at Amazon ML Solutions Lab. We call this data set the UCSD LISA Amazon MLSL Vehicle Attributes Dataset, or LAVA for short. So this data set was captured in Southern California and contains hundreds of hours of drives under a variety of conditions, including different lighting conditions, weather conditions, traffic conditions, and roadway conditions. The data is high resolution and it's time-stamped and synchronized, and we also have centimeter level localization. and most importantly, we have fine-grained attributes that we label for every frame in this data set, which is missing in most other public data sets. So for example, consider this vehicle right here. In addition to labeling the detection box and the track IDs, we also label finer attributes like the license plate location, the headlights and taillights, including the headlight and taillight states. And things like these might be very useful for vehicle identification, intent estimation, motion forecasting, and planning. Moving on to static objects like traffic lights and signs. Once again, in addition to labeling the boxes, we also label the type of the sign. And we also label for traffic lights, we also label the states of the traffic lights. And once again, these would be very useful for mapping, motion forecasting, and planning. So for roadway elements like lanes, unlike most other public data sets, we actually label all lanes in our direction of travel instead of just the immediately adjacent lanes. We also label different delimiters like road curbs, crosswalks, and any other rule governing delimiters. And each lane is further assigned a color and type. So it could be solid dashed, and it could be yellow, double yellow, single white, and so on. And this we plan to use to create HD maps and also for motion forecasting. And finally, we have a centimeter level localization in this data set for all our frames using GLONASS and real-time kinetics. The ego vehicle is localized in most cases to within a few centimeters, which gives us lane level localization. And we plan to use this to create HD maps for planning and prediction. And we also use our collaborators' expertise in labeling and a lot of their automated tools like Amazon SageMaker Ground Truth, which helps us label different elements and also automates the labeling quite a bit. That speeds up the entire labeling process. And we also have more announcements to come later this year, so please stay tuned. And if you have any more questions on this data set, you can scan this QR code here. That would take you to a blog post with more information. And if you're interested in any of the research that I've presented today, you can find our code and models and the papers on our website here. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here.
Thank you, Akshay, for your nice presentation and keynote talk. I have checked the blog post already. It's really interesting to read about this lava dataset. I have a couple of questions about the dataset, actually. Did you anonymize the camera images before you include them into the dataset?
Yes, so we do that. And I think some of the images that I showed also, I think we had anonymized the license plates. And yeah, that is something we plan to do, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you also plan to add 3D annotations into the dataset?
Yes, so probably not this year. So we plan to do an extension to the dataset. So I think we first plan to release the dataset with just as a video dataset with images and image level labels. But later on, I think we are collecting 3D data simultaneously. So we are collecting a lot of data simultaneously, which we plan to label next year, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how long did it take to create this data set to label all these objects?
So we are still doing that, and that's the reason why it's not out yet. It is a lot of work, but once again, I think we are trying to automate by doing a lot of things. So one of the, I think, key developments in the field itself is off-board perception, something called off-board perception. And it basically involves using really large and but more accurate models offline to get labels automatically. So these are basically models much larger than what you would usually deploy online in the real world when you're using them. So we are actually trying to automate a lot of it. So we're using pre-trained models, really large models that are accurate to get first estimates of all these labels, which we then sort of iterate over to correct and process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I also have a question. Thanks for your nice talk. In your talk, you mentioned about 3 approaches to increase the labeled data size, like simultaneous data and label capture, automatic labeling with using auxiliary sensors, and task-specific data augmentation. Which of these approaches seem to be more promising to increase the labeled data size?
So I think the most promising one, or the first one that I would always go for, is the one that needs the least effort from a human perspective. So the first one I would always go for is an automatic labeling approach, similar to the ones I presented for the hand analysis block, because you can get really accurate labels without doing anything. But there's a lot of tasks where you can't actually do that. So in that case, I would revert to something like the gaze analysis part, where is there a way you can collect the data or store the data so that you already have the labels, rather than collecting all the data beforehand and then sitting down and classifying or assigning classes to each image? Can you collect the data in such a way that you already have the labels? So it's actually, so I would first try to do it, if possible, completely automatically. And if that's possible, then great. But if that's not possible, then you have to think of some other ways that it could either be semi-automatic or human-assisted labeling or something involving active learning.
Thank you. And also one more question. According to my understanding, for this hands analysis and face analysis, you use RGB data, yeah?
Yes. So for for hand analysis, we use the depth data. So RGB data is only used during training to do the chroma key labels. And then once you have the labels, we just use the depth data during deployment or during testing. And for the face analysis part, we first started out using RGB data, but then since we actually intend to deploy this in the real world, and we actually have live demos that run all of these models that I described online, you need these models to work at nighttime too, right? So yes. RGB data doesn't work out in those cases. So we switched to using infrared cameras, NIR cameras, so things like that actually work at nighttime as well.
Yeah, that was my question, because I have also worked on driver monitoring, and it was crucial to use this infrared data. So I just want to learn, for example, for this eyeglasses removal, infrared data also works or not.
Oh yeah, it does. So I actually did have results on that. It's just that I didn't show them. Maybe I can bring them up. Just give me a second. Yeah. So as you can see here, so this is a fairly low resolution IR camera. So the eyeglass removal results are not as good as what we got from the high-res RGB cameras. But as you can see, the last row here is what we get from our model compared to the baseline CycleGAN approach. So what CycleGAN does is it's not able to remove the eyeglasses completely, or in some cases, it actually changes the direction of gaze, whereas our approach works well in most cases, except this last case, I think we included as a failure mode.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe before the break, I can ask one final question. So what did you consider during deciding on the validation and test splits and training validation and test splits in your data sets?
So this is actually very important, and it's an excellent question. So each of these models, and I left out a lot of the quantitative results. You can check out the papers. We do a lot of quantitative results. One of the key considerations while doing or evaluating any of these models is you have to ensure that you do cross-subject testing. And what that means is the subjects that you have in your training set should not overlap with the subjects you have in your testing set. And all of our approaches, all of our models do that. So if we have 10 subjects, for instance, there might be 5 subjects in the training set and a different 5 subjects in the testing set, and there's no overlap. So that is important to ensure that your models generalize across like people.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, so now we can have the coffee break for, I don't know, 14 minutes approximately, and we will be back here at 9:45 Central European time. So thank you all again for joining and giving your talks. So we'll see each other in 14 minutes approximately. Thank you.